In the past, the ability to peer into the future was the domain of oracles, seers, and other shamans. Today, we have financial analysts, political pundits, and assorted futurologists to offer us a sense that the future is not completely unpredictable, but their record leaves a great deal to be desired. Is there a way to predict future events that would be less of a coin toss? To help us with this question, we welcome back Dan Gardner, co-author of the book Superforecasting, The Art and Science of Prediction. Dan, it's great to have you back here at TVO. How's it going?
Excellent.
Excellent. Good. We're going to have a little fun at your expense off the top here. You don't mind. You were on this program 5 years ago with your last book called Future Babble, and this is how we left our conversation then. Roll clip, please.
What we have to do when you come to making decisions is we have to make decisions that work under a variety of circumstances. We have to explore the future, we have to examine possible futures, but we have to avoid the dangerous allure of thinking that we know what the future will be.
We have to avoid the dangerous allure of knowing what the future is going to be.
Absolutely.
Dan, have you not listened to your own advice in writing a book called Superforecasting, The Art and Science of Prediction?
I am now a guru. No, I am. My thinking on this has not changed. What I meant by that was we cannot know with certainty, and we have to be humble about our ability to forecast. Some things are predictable. You know, there are some folks who say there's no predictability whatsoever. You know, all forecasting is futile. Well, that's just not true. Some things are predictable. Tomorrow, between the hours of 7 and 9, the Don Valley Parkway will be full of cars, and they will not be moving very fast. That's eminently predictable. So there's a wide range of predictability in our world, and we do have to always be humble about our ability to predict, and we also have to recognize that our ability to predict will always be vastly exceeded by our desire to predict. But we can, if we're cautious and careful and introspective and thoughtful, get better at forecasting somewhat.
Let's do a, you'll forgive me, more relevant example than the DVP will be jam-packed tomorrow morning, which I agree is a pretty easy prediction. Barack Obama deciding to green light the military mission to kill Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this?
Well, it's a really interesting question because when the CIA came to the White House, they said, we think we know that Osama bin Laden is in this compound in Pakistan. All right. Now, should you authorize this mission? Well, the first question you say is, well, how certain are you of this information? And when they went around the table, there was one CIA analyst who said, well, I think it's about an 80% probability. The next one said, I think it's about a 60% probability. The next one said 50%, and so on around the table. And finally, Barack Obama waved his hand and said, forget it. We don't have any certainty. This is a 50-50 call. We can't pretend that we have any certainty. And on the basis of the assumption that it was 50-50, he authorized the call. They went ahead, and ultimately, of course, it turned out that it was Osama bin Laden in the compound. Now, you might say, well, wasn't that a reasonable decision for Barack Obama to make? Because ultimately, it proved correct. It was fine. But no, the answer is no. What Barack Obama was doing there was a very natural sort of thinking. It's what we typically do. We tend to think in terms of forecasting the future. It will happen. It won't happen. The answer is yes, or the answer is no. And sometimes if we're forced to confront it, we recognize that there's uncertainty, and so then we say, maybe. And what Barack Obama did was he was applying what we call a three-setting mental dial. Yes, no, maybe. Okay? And he settled upon maybe. In fact, that's a terrible way of approaching the problems. And the super forecasters, the people who are demonstrably excellent at forecasting, don't do that.
They never go for maybe.
They don't go for maybe. What they do instead is quite different. In fact, scientists will recognize this because this is how science works. They start by saying, there is no certainty. Forget certainty. It's an illusion in this complex universe. So that means you drop yes and no off the dial. Well, then you're left with maybe. And if you keep saying maybe, 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 that's not terribly helpful, is it? So what you do then is you try and break down maybe into gradations of uncertainty. So you've dropped 100% off, you drop 0% off, and then all your forecasting is between 1% and 99%.
You saw Zero Dark 30, the movie about the assassination of bin Laden?
Yeah.
How differently did that movie portray what in fact actually happened in the circumstances you described earlier?
Well, in regard to this call, is Osama bin Laden there? It was actually pretty close to true, except with one important difference. In the movie, the CIA director, played by James Gandolfini, that's actually Leon Panetta, he sits down with his analysts, and the analysts do this same routine in which they're all disagreeing with each other, and they all come up with uncertain probabilistic forecasts. And then he's disgusted by this. He doesn't appreciate this. And then they go to the heroine, and the heroine says, it's 100%. Okay, forget it. I'll say 95% because you're freaked out by certainty. So, right? And we're supposed to be with the CIA director and saying, oh man, these people don't have any courage. They don't have any guts. You got to say 100% or not. You know, what are these probabilities? Probabilities are for cowards, right? Well, guess what? I interviewed Leon Panetta, and Leon Panetta said, nothing is certain. And also, Leon Panetta said that CIA analyst did not say 100%. She said 95%. And that's what any intelligent person in that position would say, because even though the information piles up and your confidence increases, is it possible, even slightly, that your information is false? Yes, in almost all cases. Then you have to acknowledge that level of uncertainty. And if you think that those little minuscule bits of uncertainty don't matter, no, they certainly do. They certainly do. Remember that the U.S. intelligence community said that it was certain that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
Slam dunk, I think was the expression.
Slam dunk. They didn't say it's 60%, it's 70%. And if you ask yourself, would it have made a difference if they had gone to Congress and the intelligence community's report said it's 70% that he has weapons of mass destruction? In fact, there were many congressmen on the record saying, yeah, that would have made a difference, right? That certainty was very, very compelling, and it was foolish.
So let's talk about the people who do this. And one of the things, or one of the areas in which they do this, are these forecasting tournaments. What are they?
Yeah. So my co-author, Philip Tetlock, a very eminent psychologist in the United States, has been studying research since forecasting since the 1980s. And what he quickly realized is that if you're going to test forecasting, if you're going to figure out how good it is, and then determine how you can get better at it, you can't simply take what some pundit says in the newspaper and judge it, because so often they use vague language like it may happen, it could happen. They use vague terms that can't be nailed down precisely. And the other problem is that forecasters aren't always predicting exactly the same thing over exactly the same time frame, so you can't compare the accuracy of one forecaster's forecasting with another's. And so if you want to really approach this scientifically, what you need to do is have what he calls forecasting tournaments, which is to say you get all sorts of folks together and you give everybody the same questions. The questions are written very precisely to remove ambiguity about what is and what isn't a right outcome. And they have very precise time frames. So you say, will Greece default by January 31st, fill in the year. You don't leave sort of open-ended questions with vague terminology.
Okay, and who are the people who participate?
Okay, and so in this particular tournament that we write about in Superforecasting, the U.S. Intelligence Committee, one agency of which, sponsored a whole bunch of university-based teams, including Phil Tetlock's, to forecast intelligence analysts' questions, big questions like, will Greece default, what will the price of oil do, that sort of thing. And what Phil's research team did was they went out and recruited volunteers. Ordinary folks, whoever wanted to apply could come and make forecasts like the intelligence community does about these big, important geopolitical events. And for the most part, they're just regular folks.
No special expertise in any particular field?
Typically, no. We start the book by talking about, for example, Bill Flack. Bill Flack is a semi-retired former employee of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He lives in Kearney, Nebraska. He's a very smart guy.
Why is he so good at super forecasting?
Well, that's the interesting question, isn't it, right? So at the end of this tournament, when we had hundreds of questions, the results of hundreds of questions, and you look at these top people, these really, truly excellent, demonstrably excellent forecasters, you ask yourself, why are they so good? Why is Bill Flack so good? Well, the first thing you can rule out is they're not psychics. They don't have some sort of innate talent. In fact, the analysis shows that it's the style of thinking that they bring to the problem. They're not experts, right? It's not, they don't have access to classified information.
So what's the style?
Well, that's the style. The critical thing is when they sit down, like everybody else, and they're asked a question about what's going to happen, they immediately have an intuitive hunch, as we all do, right? They don't go with that. That's step one.
With the intuitive hunch.
They do not go with the. That's step one. Don't do what pundits on television do. Okay, what they do is they say, well, that's my starting point. I have this belief, but for them, a belief is only a hypothesis to be tested. And so they're extremely analytical, extremely rigorous, they unpack their own thinking constantly. And they go and look for other people's thinking. They go and look for what the experts are saying. They go and look for other data sources. And by the way, I want to emphasize, these are ordinary folks at home. Literally, their research consists of what they can find on the internet, right? Their first stop is Google.
Okay.
And so they synthesize this information in ways that is extremely effective.
Now, you did some tests yourself, right, with some famous people? Mm-hmm. Who were some of the people you brought to bear for your tests?
Sorry, which tests?
Well, the ones where you tried to get a bunch of famous people together and see what their forecasting ability was like.
Oh, right.
Pundits.
Sorry. Pundits, yes, pundits. One of the things that Phil has tried to do his whole career is to reach out to famous pundits who make the forecasts that inform our discussions about important events and say, how good are you, right? Yeah. Come and join our forecasting tournament and have your forecasting ability tested, scientifically tested, in the same way these ordinary folks are having their ability tested. And Phil has consistently failed to attract anybody to join these forecasting tournaments because the incentives just aren't there.
Well, they know they're no good at it, right? At the end of the day, they're I don't want to say they're bluffing, but the reality is their forecasting is, even if they think they're experts, is no better than anybody else's, eh?
It may be. I want to be cautious here.
Okay.
I want to be cautious. I have reason to suspect that that may be true, but I can't say it with great confidence until such time as they sit down and allow their forecasting to be tested as rigorously as Bill Flack's forecasting was tested. Mm-hmm. We can't say that so definitively, but that's the outrageous thing, isn't it? Stop and think about this. I know that Bill Flack is an outstanding forecaster. I can show you the scientific evidence. What about Paul Krugman? What about Thomas Friedman? What about any famous pundit you care to name? What about the CIA? What about all the big corporations that make a lot of money selling forecasting?
Well, let me pick up on one of those, the CIA. The CIA, despite its resources, did not forecast the end of the Soviet Empire when it in fact fell. And yet, that's their job.
Yep.
How perturbed, I know how perturbed the politicians of the day were that the CIA didn't see that coming, but how about the analysts inside the CIA? How perturbed are they that they didn't see it coming?
They take it seriously, depending upon the particular incidents. For example, one of the great forecasting failures was the 1979 Iran Revolution. They failed to see that coming. There were failures in regard to the fall of the Soviet Union. And of course, the granddaddy of all failures was 2002, 2003, the Iraq weapons of mass destruction. There is considerable evidence that they were stunned by the failure of their call on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And that's, in fact, probably one of the reasons why this agency, IARPA, which is one of the 17 intelligence agencies that make up the U.S. intelligence community, decided to fund this forecasting tournament because they've begun to realize, look, we have spent decades and billions of dollars making forecasts. How good are they? We don't know. It's never been tested. They actually don't have the proper answer to that really basic question, and that's just not acceptable.
How about this, though? Life today is more complicated and unpredictable than it's ever been. And so, as you'll excuse the expression, the future ain't what it used to be, right? It's harder than ever to do this, theoretically. Isn't that right?
It may be. It may be. One of the great things about these forecasting tournaments is that they give us a better sense of what is and isn't possible to forecast. So in some of Phil's earlier research, he asked experts to forecast 2, 3, 4, 5, and more years out. And when you get to 3, 4, 5 years out on political events, it's kind of, forget it. Just
Well, let me pick up on the politics, and I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, admittedly, but let's go 2 elections ago, the 2011 election in Canada. Nobody predicted the Liberals would come third. Nobody predicted the NDP would become the opposition. Nobody predicted Stephen Harper would win a majority government. Nobody predicted 2 leaders would lose their seats in that election, as Michael Ignatieff and Gilles Duceppe did. Nobody predicted the almost extinction of the Bloc Québécois. And yet all those people who made predictions going into the election, the media went back to them and asked them to make predictions about the next election after that.
That's it.
Well, why do we do that? Why do we waste our time doing that when these people have proved beyond a shadow of a doubt they're lousy at making forecasts?
Because we want the illusion of knowledge. We want the illusion of knowing, of having some degree of certainty, right? Remember that underlying all of this, we have a profound psychological aversion to uncertainty. We want to believe that we know. And so when you go back to a pundit and the pundit says with great force and confidence, this is what's going to happen, that's psychologically satisfying. Well, of course, rationally, we should go the next step, which is after the forecast is over, go back and take a look. And if we want to go the next step, we could say when the person makes the forecast, okay, that's very interesting, but tell me, what's your score?
Yeah.
What's your track record? Has your forecasting ever been scientifically verified? If it hasn't, and in almost all cases we're saying it hasn't, if it hasn't been scientifically verified, why should I give it credence? Think about it in terms of medicine. A doctor comes along and says, I'm going to prescribe to you these pills, and you say, well, this is medicine, it's very serious stuff. Has it been scientifically tested for efficacy and safety? And the doctor says, nope, swallow it. Would you? No, you probably shouldn't, but we're swallowing it all the time with forecasting.
Right answers you want, but you also say in the book that you need to ask obviously good and right questions in order to get right answers. Let's do an example. What's a good question?
Well, you know what? Sometimes in our book and elsewhere, we've been hard on Tom Friedman. But I would...
This is a Middle East reporter, New York Times columnist, etc.
Right. And uber pundit, right?
Yeah.
The global pundit.
Yeah.
But one of the things I think Tom Friedman is truly excellent at is looking at a problem like, for example, the Arab Spring when it was unfolding in 2011, and saying, well, what are the questions? Going forward, what are the questions we can think about? That's terrific. That's a good first step. But the problem is that we don't then take the next step, which is to analyze those people who offer answers, which is sometimes Tom Friedman, and say, all right, but wait a second, before I accept your answers, I want to hear what your score is.
Let's finish up on this. We are all, I guess, in some way or another in our own ordinary lives, forecasters. It doesn't matter what you do. You get married, you're sort of forecasting that you're going to be able to make a life with this person. If you go and buy a house, you're making a forecast that the real estate market isn't going to go into the toilet and that you're going to have some kind of nest egg there at the end of the day. So we're all making bets on our ability to predict the future. Are there principles that you have discovered that we can bring to bear in our own ordinary lives that would be helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always start with this one. It unites, I think, so much of what the super forecasters do to come up with accurate forecasts. They are intellectually humble. It sounds like a philosophical observation. They're saying, look at this complex universe. My ability to forecast it is going to be pretty darn limited. But if you start from that point, certain things follow from that. So, for example, I talked earlier about probabilistic forecasting, right? Probabilistic thinking. So if you start from, I'm being intellectually humble, the world is complex, well, you immediately say, well, certainty is kind of an illusion. I'm going to drop 100% and 99% and start thinking probabilistically. That's a great first step. Another simple example that we talked about in the book is what statisticians call base rates. So if I say, what are the odds that there's going to be a border clash between Vietnamese and Chinese military forces within the next 5 years? Well, most people will just plunge into the particular problem that they're facing. And they'll say, well, what are the politics, who's involved, and so on. Well, that's not where super forecasters will start. They'll start with the base rate, which is to say that they'll look at, well, what about the preceding 5 years, and the 5 years before that, and the 5 years before that? And they'll start, and they'll get that information and distill it down, and then they'll start from there before they get into the particulars of the issue that they're looking at. So there's all these simple little things, but they all start from, and I think are driven by, this intellectual humility, which I think is axiomatic in all their thinking.
And rare, because who considers themselves an intellectual wants to actually think of themselves as humble at the same time?
Well, and that's it. And it's also very difficult. It's psychologically difficult. Remember, our psychology is designed to give us quick answers that we feel strongly. Yeah, that seems right. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, it's true. We're done, right? Final answer. That's not the final answer for the super forecasters. Whenever they have a conclusion, they say, well, that's not the end of my analysis. That's just the beginning. I've got to test this hypothesis. And that's, as I say, it's contrary to human nature, but it's absolutely fundamental to good forecasting.
Should we test your skill on super forecasting right now? Let's try this. Dan, when is this interview over?
Now?
You are amazing. Good for you. You've obviously read your own book. That's Dan Gardner. He's the co-author of Superforecasting, The Art and Science of Prediction. He's also the editor of Policy Options magazine. Dan, great to have you back here at TVO. Thanks so much.
Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.